They told her no human could ever matter. So she made sure they didn't, until the day the universe proved her wrong. The chamber was silent except for the low hum of energy fields stabilizing the towering columns around Queen Zyra's throne, her 8-foot frame casting a long shadow across the polished obsidian floor as distant stars flickered through the transparent dome above, each one a reminder of the empire she ruled, without question or equal. Her turquoise skin catching the cold light in shifting patterns like living metal, while her golden eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon beyond the palace. Walls, calculating, always calculating, because in her world nothing existed without purpose and nothing survived without strength, and humans, as far as she was concerned, had neither. They were fragile, chaotic, biologically inefficient creatures that burned too fast and thought too little, a species that expanded with reckless ambition yet lacked the evolutionary discipline her kind had perfected over millennia. She had studied them briefly once, just enough to dismiss them, pink-skinned. Anomalies with unstable emotional patterns and a reproductive system so primitive it bordered on absurdity. No cycles, no hierarchy, no genetic refinement, just uncontrolled continuity. It made no sense to her, and so she had laughed, a quiet, dismissive sound that echoed in the chamber like a final verdict, but the universe did not ask for her approval before it changed the rules. The warning came as a tremor first, subtle enough that only her heightened senses registered the shift in atmospheric pressure. Then the alarms followed, sharp and immediate, cutting through the calm like a blade as crimson symbols flashed across the chamber walls, an unidentified object entering orbit at catastrophic velocity, 12,000 miles per hour and accelerating. Her guards moved instantly, disciplined and precise, but Zyra did not rise, not yet, because curiosity, that rare and unwelcome trait, stirred in her chest as the holographic display ignited before her, showing the object. Tearing through the upper atmosphere, a human vessel, damaged, spiraling, burning with friction as it broke apart in streaks of fire across the sky. Impossibly small against the vastness of her world, yet refusing to disintegrate completely. Something about it lingered, persisted, like defiance given form, and when it finally vanished beyond the horizon, the impact registering seconds later as a distant shockwave that rolled across the plains like thunder, Zyra exhaled. Slowly, her expression unchanged but her thoughts no longer as certain as before, because in a universe governed by precision, accidents were anomalies, and anomalies demanded answers. She turned slightly, her voice calm, almost indifferent. "Prepare a retrieval unit," she said, though her eyes remained on the fading trail in the sky. And for the first time in a long while, something unfamiliar moved beneath her control, not fear, not doubt, but something quieter, something more dangerous, the beginning of a question she had never needed to ask, and far beyond the palace walls, buried beneath frozen ground and shattered metal, Ethan Cole took his first breath on a world that was never meant to know his name. The cold hit him before the pain did, a sharp, invasive chill that cut through the fractured hull and seeped into Ethan Cole's bones as warning lights flickered weakly across his visor, the display stuttering between red alerts and failing systems, while the world outside settled into a blinding white silence. He hung there for a moment, suspended by his harness, listening to the slow creak of metal contracting in sub-zero air. Then he exhaled and unlatched himself, boots hitting what used to be the ceiling with a dull thud as gravity reoriented his senses and reality followed a second later. "Okay," he muttered, voice steady despite the chaos, still alive. His training was not military, not heroic, just practical, engineering protocols and survival checklists, and that was enough. It had to be. He moved quickly, pulling open the emergency panel, checking power reserves, oxygen levels, thermal output, each number worse than the last. The external temperature reading blinked at -60 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. His suit could compensate, but not forever, not without a working power core. He grabbed what he could carry, a portable thermal unit, a compact repair kit, a half-functional scanner, and stepped out into the alien storm. The wind greeted him like a living force, howling across the frozen terrain and driving particles of ice against his visor with a relentless hiss. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, the horizon swallowed by a white void. That made direction feel theoretical at best, but his scanner picked up something. A structure, large, metallic, partially shielded, about 1.2 miles to the north. Not ideal, but it was something, and something was all he needed. He started walking, each step deliberate, boots crunching into layers of frozen ground that sounded almost like glass under pressure. His breath slowed, controlled, conserving energy, conserving heat, his mind staying ahead of his body, calculating distance, time, probability, and somewhere in that process, he felt it. Not a sound, not a signal, just a shift, the subtle awareness that he was no longer alone. He stopped, turning slightly, visor scanning the empty storm. Nothing, just wind and white. And the distant hum of his failing equipment. Probably nothing, he said quietly, more for rhythm than reassurance, and kept moving. But high above him, unseen through the storm, a silent craft descended without flame or noise, its hull bending light itself as it observed, calculated, and confirmed. The anomaly had survived. Inside, Queen Zyra stood motionless as the live feed sharpened, her golden eyes narrowing just slightly as she studied the human figure struggling across her frozen world. Smaller than expected, weaker by every measurable standard, and yet still moving, still adapting, still refusing to collapse under conditions that would have broken lesser species long before impact. He should not be alive, one of her advisors said carefully, but Zyra did not respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the way the human adjusted his pace against the wind, angling his body, conserving motion, not reacting with panic but with intention, and that, more than anything, disrupted her certainty, because survival without design, without genetic superiority, without control, was not supposed to look like this. It was not supposed to exist at all, and yet there he was, a contradiction walking through a storm that obeyed no one. And for the first time, Zyra did not feel amusement. She felt curiosity sharpen into something else, something quieter, something far more dangerous. "Bring him to me," she said at last, her voice low and absolute, and the craft above shifted course, descending toward the lone human who had no idea that his next step would carry him out of survival and into the center of an empire that had already begun to change because of him. The wind never saw it coming. The moment the sky above Ethan shifted without sound, without warning, just a distortion in the storm like reality itself bending around something larger, something deliberate. He stopped mid-step, his scanner glitching as readings spiked and collapsed at the same time. "That is not normal," he said under his breath, lifting his visor slightly to clear the frost before sealing it again as a shadow formed through the white haze ahead, not falling, not drifting, but descending with impossible control. The air itself seemed to part for it. And then it revealed itself, a craft unlike anything he had ever seen, smooth and angular at the same time, its surface reflecting nothing, absorbing everything, hovering just 30 feet above the frozen ground without a single visible thruster or emission. Ethan did not raise a weapon. He did not have one worth raising. Instead he stood there, shoulders squared, breathing steady, because panic would not help him and curiosity, despite everything, refused to stay quiet. The craft opened without a sound, a seam of light slicing across its hull as a platform extended downward, and figures emerged, tall, armored, precise in their movements. Their presence alone enough to confirm one thing: he was no longer dealing with an empty planet. He lifted his hands slightly, not in surrender but in clarity. "Not here to cause trouble," he called out, voice carried thin by the wind, but steady enough to be understood. The figures did not respond. They did not need to. A field of soft blue light enveloped him, scanning, analyzing, mapping every inch of his body and suit in seconds. His display flickered wildly as foreign signals overrode his systems, and for a brief moment, he felt completely exposed, not physically, but fundamentally, like something was reading him in ways no machine ever should. Then just as quickly, the light faded, and the platform shifted, inviting without asking. Ethan hesitated for half a second, long enough to acknowledge the choice, then stepped forward, because survival had always been about moving toward the unknown, not away from it. And as the platform lifted him into the craft, The storm below swallowed the last trace of his presence like he had never been there at all, inside. The temperature stabilized instantly, warm, controlled, the air carrying a faint metallic scent that hinted at systems far beyond his understanding. The interior was vast, far larger than the exterior suggested, walls curved with a design that felt organic rather than manufactured, and at the far end of the chamber, elevated slightly above the rest, she stood. Queen Zyra did not move as he approached, did not shift or react in any visible way, but her presence filled the space more completely than the structure itself. 8 feet tall, composed, absolute, her turquoise skin reflecting the ambient light in subtle waves while her golden eyes locked onto him with a precision that felt sharper than any blade. Ethan stopped about 10 feet away, instinct guiding him more than logic, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty, it was measuring, weighing, deciding, and then Zyra tilted her head ever so slightly, studying him not as a threat, not as an equal, but as something far more perplexing. You survived atmospheric entry, system failure, and sub-zero exposure without structural enhancement, she said, her voice calm, resonant, each word perfectly controlled. Explain. Ethan let out a slow breath, a faint smile touching the corner of his lips despite everything. Honestly, he said, glancing briefly at the frost still clinging to his suit, I am still figuring that out myself. Something shifted then, subtle but undeniable, not in her posture, but in the space between them, because for the first time since his arrival, the equation had changed, and Queen Zyra was no longer looking at a human she had already dismissed. She was looking at a question she could not yet answer. You are not supposed to exist in my equations, Zyra said quietly, and for the first time, it did not sound like judgment, it sounded like uncertainty. The chamber responded to her voice with a subtle shift in lighting. As if the ship itself recognized the change in tone, Ethan noticed it immediately. The way the environment adjusted around her presence, the way every surface seemed to align with her. Not out of programming, but something closer to obedience. He exhaled slowly, taking in the details now that he was no longer freezing. The air temperature steady at a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Gravity slightly lighter than Earth, but consistent. The walls humming with energy that did not flicker or strain. Everything here was precise, controlled, intentional. Everything except him. I get that a lot, he replied, his voice calm, not defensive, just honest. Zyra's eyes narrowed slightly, not in irritation, but focus, as if recalibrating her understanding of him in real time. Your species is categorized as unstable, she continued, stepping forward just enough to reduce the distance between them. Her movement smooth, measured, each step carrying the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to hurry. Emotionally driven, biologically inefficient, lacking refinement. Ethan let out a small breath through his nose, something close to amusement. You forgot stubborn, he said, glancing briefly at the faint scorch marks still lining his suit. We are very good at not quitting. That earned a pause, a real one. Zyra's gaze shifting slightly as she processed not just his words but the way he delivered them. No fear, no attempt to impress, no submission, just a statement of fact, and that, more than anything, disrupted her expectations. She turned slightly, gesturing toward a nearby console that extended from the wall, like a living structure responding to her intent. Data streams illuminated instantly, flowing in symbols and patterns too complex for human systems. Your physiology is being analyzed, she said. Every variable, every response, every anomaly. Ethan nodded, stepping a little closer but stopping short of crossing whatever invisible boundary existed between observation and intrusion. And what does it say? He asked. Zyra's eyes flickered briefly toward the display, then back to him. It says you should not have survived, she answered, her voice quieter now, almost contemplative. It says your biological limits were exceeded by 23% during atmospheric entry. Your thermal tolerance should have failed at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and yet you continued. Ethan shrugged slightly, the movement small but deliberate. Sometimes numbers do not account for intent, he said, and for a fraction of a second, something passed through Zyra's expression that no data could quantify. Not agreement, not disagreement, something in between, something unresolved. The ship hummed softly around them, systems adjusting, monitoring, responding. And then without warning, the console shifted again, a new set of readings emerging. Sharper, more focused, Zyra's attention snapped back to the data, her posture tightening just enough to signal change. Ethan followed her gaze instinctively. Though he could not interpret the symbols, he could read the reaction. "That does not look like good news," he said quietly. Zyra did not respond immediately, her eyes scanning the new information with a precision that bordered on intensity. Then she spoke, not to him, but to the system itself. "Run it again," she commanded, the data. Recalibrated, recalculated, confirmed, and this time, the silence that followed was different, heavier, as if the room itself understood the significance before either of them spoke it aloud. Zyra turned back to Ethan slowly, her golden eyes no longer assessing him as an external variable, but as something that had already begun to alter the system from within. "Something in your presence," she said, each word carefully controlled, "is affecting mine." Ethan blinked once, caught off guard not by the statement, but by the way she said it, not as accusation, not as warning, but as a fact she could not yet explain. And in that moment, the distance between human and alien, between certainty and question, shifted again, because whatever was happening here, it was no longer contained to observation, it had already begun. "Define affecting," Ethan said carefully, because the way Zyra held herself had changed, not outwardly, not in a way most would notice, but enough that something beneath her control had shifted. Zyra did not answer immediately, her gaze returning to the console as streams of data continued to cascade across the surface, the symbols adjusting faster now, adapting, recalculating as if trying to stabilize something that refused to remain consistent. "My species operates within fixed biological parameters," she said at last, her voice steady but quieter than before. "We do not fluctuate, we do not deviate. Every function is regulated, optimized, predictable." Ethan nodded slowly, recognizing the tone, not arrogance, but certainty built over generations. "And now," he prompted. Zyra's fingers hovered just above the interface, not touching, just guiding as the system responded to her proximity. "Now there is deviation," she said. "Minor, but measurable. My core temperature has increased by 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit without external stimulus. Neural activity has elevated beyond baseline." And she paused, just briefly, as if selecting the correct interpretation. "My system is compensating for something it cannot categorize." Ethan shifted his weight slightly, processing that. "You are saying I am interfering," he said. Zyra's eyes lifted to meet his again. "I am saying your presence correlates with changes that should not occur," she corrected, precise even in uncertainty. Ethan let out a quiet breath, running a hand along the side of his suit. The material still cold in places despite the stabilized environment. "On Earth, we would call that stress," he said, half thoughtful, half testing. Zyra's expression did not change, but something in her gaze sharpened. "Stress implies instability," she replied. "This is something else." The way she said it made the word feel incomplete, like a concept still forming. The system chimed softly, drawing her attention again, the data refining, isolating variables, narrowing possibilities, and then a new sequence appeared, one that held her focus longer than the others. Ethan watched her closely now, not the screen, but her, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the almost imperceptible change in her breathing, and he realized something important. Whatever this was, it was not just theoretical, it was happening in real time. "You are not just observing it," he said quietly. "You are feeling it." Zyra did not deny it, but she did not confirm it either, her gaze still locked on the data, as if looking away might disrupt whatever fragile understanding she was building. "Your species relies heavily on physical proximity," she said instead, shifting the focus slightly. "Contact, shared space, environmental influence." Ethan gave a small, almost amused nod. "Yeah, we are not great at keeping distance," he admitted. Zyra stepped closer then, just one measured step, reducing the space between them by a fraction that felt far more significant than the distance itself. The air seemed to respond again, subtle, but noticeable. Ethan felt it this time, not as heat, not as pressure, but as awareness, like standing too close to something powerful without fully understanding why. Zyra's eyes studied him at this closer range, more detailed now, taking in the texture of his skin, the rhythm of his breathing, the micro-adjustments in his posture. And the system responded instantly, readings spiking again, sharper this time, more defined. There, she said softly, not to him, but to the confirmation forming in the data. Ethan exhaled slowly, holding his ground despite the instinct to step back, because something told him that would make it worse, not better. If I move, he said, does it change? Zyra considered that, then gave a slight nod. Move, she said. Ethan took one step backward, slow, deliberate, and the shift was immediate. The readings dropped, not completely, but enough to register the difference. Zyra's gaze flicked to the console, then back to him, and for the first time, there was no attempt to mask it, no effort to maintain absolute control, just a quiet, undeniable realization. It is proximity, she said, the conclusion settling into the space between them. Not as a solution, but as the beginning of a far more complex question. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. So standing too close to you breaks your system, he said lightly, trying to ground the moment in something familiar. Zyra's eyes held his, steady, unblinking. No, she said, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper now, something that had not been there before. It does not break it, she paused, just long enough for the weight of the next words to settle. It changes it. Then we need to find out what happens if it keeps changing, Ethan said, and the moment the words left his mouth, the room seemed to hold its breath, not because of what he said, but because of what it implied. Zyra did not respond immediately, her gaze shifting once more to the console where the data had begun to stabilize into patterns, not predictable ones, but repeating enough to form something dangerously close to a trend. Her fingers moved this time, precise and deliberate, activating deeper scans, isolating variables down to the molecular level. The system responded with a low harmonic tone, layers of information unfolding in complex structures that even Ethan could recognize as far beyond human capability. My biology does not adapt without cause, she said slowly, more to the data than to him. Every function is governed by design. Deviation without purpose is inefficient. Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching her work. Or it is evolution, he offered, not as a challenge, just a possibility. Zyra's eyes flickered toward him, sharp, assessing. Evolution requires generational time, she replied. It does not occur in isolated instances. Ethan gave a small shrug. On Earth, sometimes it feels like it does, he said, half thoughtful, half honest. Pressure changes things faster than systems expect. Zyra turned fully toward him now, the distance between them still carefully measured, but her attention no longer divided. You are suggesting that your presence is a catalyst, she said. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. I am saying I am the only new variable in your environment, he replied. That makes me a good place to start. The logic was simple, almost obvious, and yet the implication carried weight Zyra could not ignore. She stepped closer again, not testing now, but confirming. The system responded instantly, readings rising, stabilizing at a new threshold rather than spiking unpredictably. Her breathing shifted, subtle but present, her posture adjusting in ways that suggested compensation rather than resistance. And this time, she did not step back. She held the position, allowing the change to continue. It is stabilizing, she said quietly, more surprised by that than anything else so far. Ethan noticed it too. Not in numbers, but in the way the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. The way the air between them felt less like a disruption and more like a connection. So it is not damage, he said. It is adjustment. Zyra's gaze remained steady, but something behind it had shifted. The rigid certainty that had defined her earlier now threaded with something else, something more fluid. Adjustment implies compatibility, she said, the word unfamiliar in this context. Almost reluctant, Ethan let out a small breath, a hint of a smile forming despite the gravity of the moment. Well, that is new, he said. Zyra did not mirror the expression, but she did not dismiss it either, her attention returning briefly to the data, which now displayed a consistent pattern, her internal systems recalibrating around his presence rather than rejecting it. And that, more than anything, altered the equation entirely. This should not be possible, she said, not as a refusal, but as a statement of fact being rewritten in real time. Ethan glanced at the console, then back at her. A lot of things are not supposed to be possible until they are, he said. Zyra held his gaze for a long moment, longer than necessary for analysis, longer than required for understanding. And in that silence, something deeper settled, not just curiosity, not just anomaly, but recognition of a threshold being crossed, not by force, not by design, but by simple, undeniable presence, and somewhere within the layers of her system, beyond the measurable data and controlled responses, something new continued to form, quiet, persistent, and no longer willing to be ignored. Your council will not accept this, Ethan said quietly, and this time the words landed heavier than anything before, because they were not about biology or data or systems, they were about consequence. Zyra did not look away from him, but something in the chamber shifted again, the lighting dimming slightly, as if responding to a change in priority. They will not, she replied, her voice steady, but the certainty behind it no longer carried the same absolute weight. The console behind her pulsed with new alerts, subtle at first, then more persistent, external signals requesting access, encrypted, formal, and unmistakably authoritative. Ethan glanced toward the display. Even without understanding the symbols, he could recognize urgency when he saw it. That them? He asked. Zyra gave a small nod. The High Council monitors all anomalies within Imperial systems, she said, her tone returning to something more structured, more controlled. And you are now classified as one. Ethan let out a quiet breath, not surprised, just acknowledging the shift. I have been called worse, he said, trying to keep the moment grounded. But Zyra did not respond with even a hint of amusement this time. Her attention split between him and the growing cascade of signals. They will demand your removal, she continued, more to herself now than to him. Containment or elimination, depending on their interpretation. Ethan held her gaze, not stepping back, not moving closer, just staying exactly where he was. And what do you think? He asked, the question simple, but the weight behind it undeniable. Zyra paused, and for the first time since he had entered her world, the answer did not come immediately. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of calculation that no longer followed a single predictable path. The data behind her continued to update, her internal systems still adapting, still responding to his presence in ways that defied every established rule. And somewhere within that process, a decision was forming, not from protocol, not from design, but from something far less defined. I think, she said slowly, each word chosen with care, that removing you would not resolve the anomaly. Ethan nodded slightly. It would just remove the only variable you can study, he added. Zyra's eyes flickered with recognition, not of agreement, but of alignment. Correct, she said, and then the console chimed again, louder this time, the request escalating, authority pressing in from beyond the chamber, beyond the ship, beyond even her immediate control. The High Council was no longer waiting. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, not out of fear, but readiness. Sounds like you are about to have a very political conversation, he said. Zyra's gaze returned fully to him, and this time, there was no distance left in it, no detached analysis, only focus, sharp and deliberate. You will remain here, she said, not as an order, but as a decision already made. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. That was not really a request, was it? He said. Zyra did not respond verbally, but the air around them seemed to settle into something more defined, more intentional, the ship itself adjusting its systems as if aligning with her choice. And then, with a single motion, she terminated the incoming request, the signals cutting off mid-transmission, silence replacing pressure, and in that silence, the weight of what she had just done settled into place, not as rebellion, not as defiance, but as something far more dangerous. She had chosen to delay the will of her empire for the sake of a variable she did not yet understand. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching her. I am guessing that was not standard protocol, he said. Zyra's eyes held his, steady, unyielding. No, she replied, her voice calm. but carrying a depth that had not been there before. It was not. And somewhere far beyond the chamber, beyond the storm, beyond even the reach of their immediate awareness, the High Council began to notice the silence where a response should have been, and silence, in an empire built on control, was never ignored. Silence is not an option in your empire, is it? Ethan said, and this time there was no hint of humor in his voice, only observation, because even he could feel it now, the pressure building beyond the walls of the chamber, invisible but undeniable. Zyra did not answer right away, her gaze shifting past him toward the vast curve of the chamber wall as it transformed into a translucent display. The storm outside still raging across the frozen landscape, but above it, breaking through the clouds. Like descending stars, multiple signatures appeared, sharp, ordered, unmistakable, vessels, not one, not two, but an entire formation, each one holding position with perfect precision as if the sky itself had been divided into exact coordinates. They did not receive a response, Zyra said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with inevitability. Ethan turned slightly, following her line of sight. So they came to get one in person, he said. Zyra inclined her head just enough to confirm it, the console behind her shifting again as new data flooded in, not requests this time, but declarations, structured, formal, absolute. The High Council was no longer asking for access, they were asserting it. Ethan exhaled slowly, hands resting at his sides, grounded, steady. What happens now? He asked, not because he did not understand the situation, but because he needed to hear how she would define it. Zyra remained still for a moment longer, her internal systems still active, still adapting. The pattern of change within her no longer fluctuating, but stabilizing into something that felt less like anomaly and more like integration. She turned back to him, and there was no hesitation left in her movement, no delay in her response. Now, she said, her voice calm but carrying a new depth. They will expect compliance. Ethan nodded once. And you? He pressed. Zyra's golden eyes held his, unyielding, but no longer distant. I have already chosen deviation, she replied. And the words did not echo, they settled, heavy and final. The chamber responded instantly, systems shifting from passive observation to active configuration, energy levels adjusting, pathways opening. The ship aligning itself not with external command, but with her decision. Ethan felt it in the subtle change of gravity, the hum of power increasing beneath his feet. That sounds like more than just delaying a conversation, he said. Zyra stepped closer again, not testing, not measuring, but closing the distance because there was no longer a reason to maintain it. And the system responded, not with instability, but with synchronization, the readings no longer spiking, no longer compensating, but aligning, adapting to both of them as if they were no longer separate variables. It is, she said, her voice softer now, but far more certain. It is choosing a different outcome. Ethan studied her for a moment, really studied her, not the queen, not the ruler, but the being standing in front of him. And for the first time, he saw something that did not fit the image of absolute control. Not weakness, not doubt, but willingness, the kind that did not come from necessity, but from understanding. They are not going to like that, he said. Zyra's gaze shifted briefly toward the descending fleet, the lights from their hulls cutting through the storm like cold stars. No, she agreed. They will not. The ship trembled slightly as external systems attempted to establish connection. The pressure now no longer distant but immediate, and yet inside the chamber, there was a strange stillness, a pause between what had been and what would come next. Ethan let out a slow breath, grounding himself in that moment. Then I guess the question is not what they want, he said quietly. Zyra looked back at him, and for the first time since he had arrived, there was no hierarchy in her gaze, no separation of species or status, only clarity. No, she said, and the word carried more than agreement. It carried decision. The question is what we become. And outside, the first of the council vessels locked into position directly above them, waiting, not for permission, but for an answer. Then let them watch, Ethan said quietly, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice, only a steady acceptance of whatever came next. Because the moment had already passed where retreat was possible, Zyra did not respond immediately, but she did not look away either, her golden eyes fixed on him as the ship around them shifted into a new state, no longer passive, no longer observing, but active, aligned, responding to her decision with a precision that felt less like programming and more like loyalty. Outside, the council vessels held their positions, their signals now constant, insistent, a silent demand pressing against every system in her domain. The chamber dimmed slightly as external interfaces attempted to force connection, and this time, Zyra did not dismiss them. Instead, she stepped past Ethan, moving toward the central platform where the command interface rose to meet her, her presence alone activating layers of authority that rippled outward through the ship, through the storm, through the very space the fleet occupied. They will receive an answer, she said, her voice calm, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, something that had not existed before this moment. Ethan watched her, not as a subject watching a ruler, but as one variable watching another reach a conclusion, and for the first time, he understood that whatever this was, it was no longer just about him, or even her. It was something larger, something that neither of them had planned. The interface illuminated fully now, projections forming in the air around her, data, signals, pathways, all converging into a single point of communication. The council's presence pressing in from beyond, waiting, expecting compliance, expecting control. Zyra placed her hand above the interface. Not touching, just close enough to command it. And the connection opened, not as a request, but as a declaration. The chamber filled with light as the distant forms of the council manifested, their silhouettes tall, indistinct, unified in authority, their voices layered into one, calm, absolute. Queen Zyra, they said, you have delayed response to a classified anomaly. Explain. The words echoed through the chamber, precise, unyielding. Ethan remained where he was, silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because this was not his moment to speak. Zyra stood unmoving for a heartbeat longer, the data still flowing around her, the changes within her no longer unstable, no longer undefined, but present, integrated, undeniable. And then she spoke, not louder, not forceful, but clear. There is no anomaly, she said, and the chamber seemed to still itself around her words. The council paused, not in confusion, but in recalculation. Clarify. They responded. Zyra's gaze did not shift, did not waver. There is only adaptation, she continued, each word deliberate, grounded in something deeper than protocol. My system has identified compatibility where none was expected, and I will not eliminate a variable that expands our understanding of what we are. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, the kind of silence that comes when control is challenged without aggression. When logic is met with something it cannot immediately dismantle. Ethan watched the exchange, the tension, the balance, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not feel like an outsider. He felt like part of the equation. The council's presence shifted, subtle, but present, their unified form adjusting as they processed the implication of her statement. You are deviating from established doctrine, they said, not as accusation, but as confirmation. Zyra inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Yes, she replied, and there was no hesitation, no uncertainty left in her voice, only clarity. Because doctrine does not account for what we have just discovered. The chamber held that moment, suspended between what had always been and what could now exist, and somewhere beyond the reach of data and control, something else settled into place, quiet, irreversible, the beginning of a future neither human nor